Yep, it's working. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to be speaking to you guys. I want to start off, like I did last time, just saying thank you. I really appreciate you guys as a church family. People ask me how the internship's going, friends from across the country, family, and I say I have great elders. I'm really thankful for them, for supporting me and providing for me. I'm really thankful for Eric, but I always mention you guys too. My church family as a whole at Weston is amazing, and I really appreciate you guys. The text, the encouragement, all of it. Also, I want to point out, last time I gave this lesson on Luke 13, I got done and people came up to me and they had these great comments. These great comments where I was like, guys, just raise your hand. Like, those are great. Like, I don't mind at all. Like, steal the spotlight. Like, all on you. That was amazing. So please, raise your hand if you have a comment. Feel free to share. I'll turn it over to you any day of the week. So we're in Luke 16 right now. We're in Luke 16. And right now what's happening is Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, to the cross. That's still happening. And we get to Luke 16, and we see some themes happening. Some themes happening in Luke 16. It says, you can't serve God and money. That's one of the themes. And then we see this role reversal of the kingdom of heaven in the rich man and Lazarus. And this chapter is split into two sections. You could do it in other ways, but I did it in two, where you have the shrewd manager in verses 1 through 18, and then you have the rich man and Lazarus in verses 19 through 31. So first is the shrewd manager. He also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account for your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking my management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that, when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill, and sit down, and quickly write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill, and write 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealings with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in their unrighteous wealth, who can entrust you with true riches? And you have not been faithful into which is another's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. And what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries a woman divorced from her husband also commits adultery. All right. I want to start with a quote from one of my favorite scholars. His name's Erich Bulag. He says that some have said this is the hardest parable in Luke to understand. And it's really confusing at some points in the text. So that's what I want to do is I want to walk through what exactly is happening, because it's a long text. I want to walk through what's happening. I want to walk through why it's confusing and maybe some explanations for that. And then after that, I want to walk through some lessons we can take away, some applications we can take away from this text and make it not as confusing or hard to understand. So what exactly is happening here? So first we see in verse 1, he's wasting his possessions. And this is the same word or the same term that you would use for the prodigal son when he was wasting his possessions. It's not explicitly stated what's happening, what's going on, but we can assume that it's a selfish thing, that he's focusing on himself and maybe sinful things, just like the prodigal son. And then we run into this problem that this guy gets fired. He gets fired. He says, hey, basically, you have to put your 2 weeks in. You have to make your accounts right, but you're gone. You're gone. And the reason he's fired is because he's ruined not only his own reputation, but the reputation of his master. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal. But he also has this problem where he doesn't have the skills to do manual labor, and he's not desperate enough to be begging. So it's like, what is he going to do for money? How is he going to live and prosper? He's left with nothing. But what he's concerned about is not so much that he's left with nothing, not so much his master's reputation, but his relationship with people, which we'll touch on later. But what he's most concerned about in this situation is that he's lost his connection with his community. And so he wants to make that right. And so we see these debts, and these are weird numbers. These are weird numbers for us. I don't think any of us talk in like measures. Like I'm not like 100 measures of oil. You don't know what that means. If you owe me 100 measures of oil, so what? What 100 measures of oil would be like 3 years' wages for a day laborer. So like think about 3 years of salary. That's what this would be. And one commentator said that this is around 3,000 liters, and another said it was around 875 gallons. Then you have 100 measures of wheat, and this is 8 to 10 years of labor. And around 100 acres of wheat, and that'd be around 30 tons. So these are huge debts. Huge debts, and what he's doing is he's cutting the bill. He's saying, you got 50%, you have 80%. He's saying, you get the bill cut. You don't owe as much as you think you do. And then we get to the confusing verse, or the hard verse that we're going to have to work through some. And that's in verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager. And then he does this because of his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealings with their own generation than the sons of light. So one, I don't talk like that. I thought shrewd was a negative thing. I'll be completely honest. Shrewd's a positive thing. Shrewd is intelligence. It's a thoughtfulness. It's a consideration. That he's saying this person was considerate. He was thoughtful. He navigated through this situation very well. And so basically what he's saying is he's comparing these two groups, the sons of light versus the sons of this generation. And what he's saying is they know about their investments on this world better than you know about your spiritual investments. So this is my first big boy job. And if I were to ask you guys, adults, I was like, hey, how is a wise way I'm supposed to spend my money? What are good investments to make? Some of you might go safe and say, you need to set up a CD or a bond. Some of you might say stocks. That's a great way to go. Some of you might really be into land investments. You might say, hey, you need to figure out what an FHA loan is. You need to figure out how to set up an LLC if you want multiple properties. And you can explain and guide me through all these things, 401ks, IRAs. But then if I asked you, hey, how do I study through the Gospel of Mark with someone? What's a good way to do that? Or if I were to ask you, hey, what are the challenges of inviting a bunch of people into your home? What are good meals to make for a large group of people? Those might be harder questions to answer. And maybe that tells us something. That we're so concerned about this world and our wealth that we never invest into spiritual things. That we don't take that thoughtfulness we do in the same regard with our physical wealth as we do our spiritual wealth. And then we get into the dilemma. This dilemma of why is he commending a dishonest manager? It's weird phrasing, and there's multiple explanations. The first explanation to this is that we can learn from unlikely people. People that might not have the character that they should, but we can still learn valuable lessons from them. And so an example of this is the Pharisees. This is what Jesus says about the Pharisees in Matthew 23. He says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works that they do. For they preach, but they do not practice. Now, there might be an instance where a preacher is in the pulpit and he's preaching something that's from the Word of God, something that's true. And you find out later that he's doing something he shouldn't be doing. He doesn't have the character he should as a man of God. That doesn't make what he said not true. That if it's coming from the Word of God, then it's a true thing. So this is one aspect that we can take away from this, that character doesn't mean that what you're saying isn't true. Another way of looking at this is that nature doesn't always mean character. So Jesus in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 is described in this way. For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of Lord will come like a thief in the night. Now, that no one is saying that the character of God is like someone who steals. That the character of God is someone who takes away constantly. It's saying there's something about the nature of God that is like a thief in the night. So you can compare someone to something that is sinful or dishonest, not in their character, but in the nature of what's happening. Here are some other possibilities that honestly I take more weight in. One is that he's taking the difference from his own commission. So when he's cutting these debts, when he's saying instead of 100 measures of oil, you only had to pay 50, what he's doing is he's saying you're taking my cut. So let's say you owe my master 50 measures, and then I put an additional 50 measures on top of that. And that's my cut. That's what I get paid out of this situation. He's saying whatever would go to me, we're just going to eliminate that. You just have to pay what you owe my master outright. He's taking away his commission. Another way of thinking about this is he's restoring his master's reputation. The reason he's being commended is because his master really doesn't care about the money in the first place. That's not what is important. But what's important to his master is his reputation. So if he has to make deals, he has to cut it, his master's pleased, because at least his reputation is restored. And then the final one is that this dishonest, this character trait, this adjective put on this person is not describing his behavior of cutting the deals, but instead what he was doing back in verse 1. So in verse 1, when he was acting and he was wasting the riches, he was being dishonest then. And whatever he was doing in between wasn't dishonest in itself, but was referencing earlier back in his life. And so all this are different possibilities of how to think through this. So we've gotten the story. We've gotten maybe how to work through the hardship of this verse 8 that he's commending this manager, but the manager is kind of a dishonest person, so how do we reconcile that? But how do we learn from this parable? Because if we can't learn anything from this parable, then there's really no point of talking about it. We need to learn something. And so there's some lessons, some application that we can learn. The first application we can learn is in verse 9. And verse 9 is confusing within itself because it sounds kind of like you're buying friends, but that's not really what it means. It says, "And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you in the eternal dwellings." That God gives. So we just said that he has this. He's described as a thief. That's not his character, is to take away. His character is a gift giver, that God gives to us. But what I don't think we understand a lot is that God gives to us so we can give to others. And this is the purpose in him giving to us. We see this in 2 Corinthians 1, that he gives us comfort so we can comfort others. We see this in 1 Peter 4, he gives us talents and abilities so we can use them and share them with each other. We see this in Matthew 28 in the Great Commission, he gives us salvation so we can be a tool for him to spread it to others. He gives to us so we can give to others. And the same is true with our wealth. That when he gives us this wealth, what we need to be using it for is each other, to lift each other up from the hard times. And the phrasing he uses is not if it fails. He doesn't say if your wealth fails, then it's good to have these people. He says when it fails. That wealth in itself, that these riches are so fragile, that they're going to go away, that they're going to break through. And so use it while you have it for things that are important, for each other. Because it's what you'll wish you had when it's all gone. If we go back to this honest manager, he's not worried that I don't have a job lined up. He's not worried, all this wealth that I'm not going to have anymore. He's not worried about his reputation so much, but he is worried about what this all means. that he's going to have no one. He's going to have no one's house to go in, no one to spend time with. He's going to have no friends. And so if I were to give you two options, you can either have lots of money, but you have no friends. Or you have lots of friends, but maybe not that much money. I would say you would probably choose the lots of friends with no money. Because this is a need that we have in us, that we were built for each other, that we desire community. And that's one of the great things about having a church family, is that we have each other. And then in verses 10 through 12, we get this series of these different kind of just like lessons, back to back to back. The first one is in verse 10. It says, "One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much." When you start a job, at least the jobs I've had before, they give you smaller tasks. The manager trusts you with smaller tasks. And that shows your character. How are you going to handle these smaller tasks? And then maybe you get promoted and you get bigger tasks if you handled the smaller ones well. We understand this train of logic for us because our character is seen in both the small things we do and the big things we do. And so, when we are handed over very little and we deal faithful in that, someone wants to give us much because we'll be faithful with that as well, and vice versa. And the very little it's referring to here is what we would consider much in our culture and how we think about things. If I were to say millions of dollars is actually very little, and I were to say that that's someone of the world, that'd be very confusing. That the greatest riches on this world are very little in the sight of God. Because the much it's referring to here is the eternal dwelling of God, the riches that we'll have in heaven. That if you can't handle having this wealth, this very little thing, even if it's great in the sight of the world, why would God give you true riches? Something that's great, something that's truly great. And so I think this also tells us something about how we view people. It goes on, and it talks about having someone else's stuff versus it being your own. It goes on and talks about if you've been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? We talked about that some. But how do you view each other? How do we view each other in the church community? Are we most drawn to and most approaching those who have been successful in earthly terms? Those who are on the top in earthly terms, that have the most job making the most money? Or are we drawn to those with the best character? Are we drawn to those that will give us true riches, that will show us Christ through their attitude? Because it says this in verse 13, which is, I think, the summation of what's happening here. "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." And I found this quote that I think summarizes this pretty well. And it says, "When God is served, money is used beneficially. When money is served, the claims of God are ignored." That if you're serving God properly, you'll use money properly. But if you're serving money, you're just going to ignore God. That you can't serve these two things at the same time. And I think oftentimes we try to justify it to ourselves that we can do both. That we can do both and we can serve both. But it says very plainly that you can't serve both. You can't serve God and money. And we don't need to try to talk our way out of this. This is just an honest truth. We have talked about being good stewards of what God has given us, of sharing it with each other. What are some practical ways that we can live this out? How can we use our wealth wisely? Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. That's a really good point. Wes?
I agree with you. This is a very hard parable. One of the things that strikes me is though it's almost juxtaposed to James 4:4, where friendship with the world is enmity with God, right? It's almost telling us that you need to make friends with unrighteous people and unrighteous wealth. And how does that make sense to us? Well, there is a sense in which we live amongst the world and we work amongst the world. And if we are wise and we are shrewd, then we will use those people not in a way to gain for ourselves, but to gain in the kingdom. That we can use them for influences in our life, or we can use them to build wealth that then benefits the church. But there comes that point in verse 11, is that if you've been not faithful in unrighteous wealth, how will you be faithful in true riches? So if you are building unrighteous wealth in this world, then you are truly making enmity with God. But if you are building righteous wealth, that God can then entrust true riches to you, then I think you're doing this most likely the right way.
Yeah, if you're using this money, this unrighteous wealth, they're like synonymous with each other to build heavenly riches, true riches. You're using the tools that God is giving you and these opportunities to benefit the kingdom, for sure.
I don't think people in the world disdain the church because of what we believe. I think people in the world disdain the church for what we don't do. Like, there's not a problem of need in the world. There's a problem of, those of us who have food, maybe we don't give enough to the people who don't have food. Same thing with money and that sort of thing. And I think we feel the same way if you look at like super rich televangelists and like, those people are just using the blessings that God has given them, the platform God has given them to enrich themselves. And so we get jaded in those sorts of people. And the world looks at us the same way. We're doing very well. We've got nice cars, we've got nice houses, we have abundant food, et cetera, et cetera. And that people are in need. The one that always throws me in this parable is at the end of verse 9 when it talks about receiving you into eternal dwellings. And that's the only way that I can make sense of it, is when it's used properly, then we are able to do eternal good.
Yeah.
Things that really last, instead of just enriching ourselves, which goes away in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think you made multiple good points in that. And I liked how you touched on that this isn't just a thing we do with money, but a thing we can do with our lives in general. That you talked about food, that I have food and someone else doesn't, so sharing that. That many of you probably wouldn't be millionaires in here, I have no idea. Some of you probably are. And we have other things that we can give. We are very rich in the sight of the world population in general, that there's always things that we can be giving, whether that be food or our time or our talents, that we can always be giving to people in general. You have something, Brian?
Well, then that kind of leads into what I was thinking. There's a danger for Christians in this age with the wealth that we have to just kind of throw some money at something if there's a need. Not that that's bad to give money, but if it's, okay, I can just give some money this way and I don't have to get really involved.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That's a real danger. I feel like that it keeps you kind of at a distance from being really, truly involved with the situation, with the family that needs or whatever the church needs. And I'm sure that I've been guilty of that, so I don't have to get my hands dirty, get in the situation. I think there's a thing to beware there.
Yeah, we don't only need to give of our means, but also of our heart and our time and things that maybe are more valuable in the grand scheme of things. All right, we're going to keep going. Those great comments, I really appreciate you guys. It continues on, and it gets in this in-between, this weird, like it tells this parable of the dishonest manager, and then we're about to go into the rich man and Lazarus. But then it has this in-between. This in-between where it talks about the Pharisees in verse 14, and it says that the Pharisees were lovers of money. And I just want to do a self-check here, and this is just questions to ask yourself. But is this a way that you would describe yourself? Would you describe yourself as a lover of money? And I think some self-checks for this would be, do you get upset when people critique the rich? Do passages like this make you uncomfortable? Do you try to justify loving God and money at the same time? that we live in a rich nation, we live in a rich culture, and we need to be self-checking ourselves to make sure that we're valuing true riches over unrighteous wealth. That this is where our mind and our heart truly is. And then it talks about them, and it says that you justify yourself before men, but God knows your heart. And so many times we can be focused on our outer appearance, on how we look, how we present ourselves, that we're not focusing on our heart. And we've touched on this multiple times throughout. But what we need to understand is that God can see your heart. And this can be a great thing. That God can see a cheerful heart, a giving heart, but God can also see a selfish heart and one who's only taking for themselves. For sake of time, we're going to skip that question. So we're about to, this is important. So it's really random. Like I said, there's this two-part randomness in here where it goes into this law and talking about the Pharisees, and then it talks about divorce and remarriage, just in between these. The passage transitions to discussions about divorce and remarriage. How do you understand Jesus' teaching in this context? So, why is this here? Why is this sandwiched between these two parables? You guys have any thoughts or ideas? Yeah. That you're not really taking this covenant that you're taking too seriously. It even leads into things like dowries, where if I marry multiple people, I get multiple dowries. I get this wealth influx, and so I'm doing it for the money. I'm divorcing this person so I can have more money from this person. Any other ideas?
At the end of verse 17, he talks about how not one letter of the law will fall
Mm-hmm.
before the rest of the world does. And it may be the following verse is in reference to how they are eroding the law with divorce and with their with all the divorcing and things like that. Because it was a known thing, especially among the Pharisees, to collect wives and divorce them at a will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. He's giving an example of what he's referencing previously. Of this is how you're abusing the law. Here's an example of that. So this is some ideas I had. Dowries, that this is a greater gift entrusted to you. We've been talking about these riches, but you're also misusing this greater gift of marriage and this covenant and this relationship. Now that's what you're also abusing. And then an example, like you said, of being exalted among men, that men might see this as a good thing, but it's an abomination before God. All right, the rich man and Lazarus. Okay, let's do it. I love this passage. Starting in verse 19, the rich man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day, and at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed, and what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores, and the poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm that has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they should also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes from the dead, they will repent. He said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. I'm going to present 2 points of view on whether this is a parable or it is not, whether it's a parable or a story. And then I'm going to ask you which side you take. And would believing that this is a parable impact the realities it would still teach about the afterlife? So let's get into it. Is this a real life story or is this a parable? Which is it? So these are the two major points on why people think this is a real life story. These are the best two arguments, the standard. That it's not specifically introduced as a parable. And so if it's not specifically stated, we should assume it's a real story. Because how far are we going to take this train of thought? Is the Garden of Eden a parable? Is Jonah and the whale a parable? Is Egyptian captivity a parable? Is the King David a parable? Is Jesus' resurrection a parable? How far are we going to take this train of thought? And to counteract that there's widely accepted parables that are not specifically stated as parables, even in the Gospel of Luke itself. The Good Samaritan never is stated as a parable. The Great Banquet in chapter 14 and the unjust steward that we just previously read. None of these are presented as parables, but we widely accept them as such. And here is the other argument, that we use Lazarus' name specifically, that no other character in a parable has a name that's given. This is the only time. And so if this is a story, it would make sense because this is a real person. This is Lazarus, someone that Jesus knows or is aware of. But I think this also fails to see the purpose of doing so. That what's happening here is multiple things. It's highlighting the difference between the rich man and Lazarus. That the great thing about the rich man was his riches. And the great thing about Lazarus was who he was, his character. It also tells us that you can see people as individuals. That we see in the afterlife Abraham, that's a person. And we see in the afterlife Lazarus as a person. That there's individuals in heaven. It's not just this great spirit that we go into and we all become one. That we're still our individual selves, that we're doing this all together. And also the name Lazarus, what it means is the one who God helps, which tells us something about the story in general, about who does God really help. It might seem like on the world here that the people that God helps aren't really being helped at all. They might seem like the beggars. But in heaven, they're truly the one who God helps because they're with him for eternity. Do you guys have any thoughts on this? On this difference between a parable and a story? Some people have really strong opinions on this. Some people don't. So I just want to give way for opportunity.
My biggest contention with it being a story is it presents the idea of prejudged judgment. That we go into a blessing or a curse before judgment, the final judgment.
Mm-hmm.
If we're assuming that time is all linear here, that is problematic because we're being judged before the actual judgment.
Yeah. There is that aspect of it that is hard to deal with, the mechanics of Judgment Day and what that looks like, what that means when we die. What does that mean? Are we in a waiting place like it's described here, or does nothing really happen? We not really know until Judgment Day. What's our perception of time when we die before Judgment Day? These are all questions that we have to kind of work through and struggle with. I think this is a possibility, but that makes sense, that there's some of those struggles that you're not as on board with when it comes to this.
It seems to be when he's speaking to the crowd, in Matthew 13:34 it says, Jesus spoke to the crowd in parables. He did not speak to them without miracles. So, judging from that, I feel like that's a parable.
Mm-hmm.
Something to help us address.
Yeah.
I would add that the parable of the prodigal son is not described as a parable, and it begins with the words, "There was a man," which also is echoed in the parable of the dishonest manager, "There was a rich man."
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to Lazarus, "There was a rich man," to introduce the parable. And then in chapter 18, the parable of the persistent widow. Here, in a certain city, there was a judge,
Yeah, great point. For sake of time, we're going to keep going. If this is a parable, it's still showing us truths about spiritual realities. That parables are based on ideas that are true. So if you look at like the parable of the sower, that these are actual concepts that you can use in farming. Now, the point of the parable is not about farming, but we can still understand and have realities that are shown through it about farming. So the same here, maybe the point, and I don't think it is, of this parable is about the afterlife, but it can still show us things that are true about this realm. It also offers us lessons about morality that we can learn from. That, like I said, this isn't just the main point, is about the afterlife, what exactly that looks like in every single detail, but there's other lessons we can learn from this. Because the main point of this text is not the afterlife, but the main point of this text is seeing the role reversal of the rich and the poor in the kingdom of heaven. That those who are poor here can be rich in heaven, and those that are rich here can be very poor in heaven. So we get this image of worldly conditions of these people. The rich man has purple robes. He lives in a gated community. He's very rich and has this sense of royalty around him. He feasts every day. He's quite full. And then you see Lazarus, who's laid at a gate. He's isolated by himself outside this gate. He's begging. He's covered with sores. He's constantly afflicted and in pain. He desires to be fed. He's not comforted, and he feels empty. And what we need to understand as we go into the rest of this parable is that we often match the rich man more than we do Lazarus. If we look at these two people, we often reflect the rich man more. And we like to victimize ourselves in stories. And we like to make ourselves the good guy in stories. But I think in this one, we need to be looking out for the rich man. What mistakes is he making? Because those are mistakes that we could be too. Then we see this reversal that happens. The rich man is buried. And this shows us he's going down. He's going away from God. And it also shows us that maybe people care about him. That Lazarus later is not said to be buried. That he's said to go up in heaven. That he's carried by angels. That Lazarus maybe wasn't buried at all. That there was no one to take care of him. But where did they go after they died? One, he's no longer called a rich man. And then the rich man becomes the one who's outside the gate. He's isolated by himself. I think this is something that's missed. We talk about this idea of being in hell or like being away from God and like everyone's together. But being together is something of comfort. That having people is something that's comforting. And what we see this image in torment is that the rich man is by himself, that there's no one else around, that Lazarus has Abraham by his side, but the rich man has no one. We see him, like we said in chapter 13, that he can see what's happening, but he's not a part of it. Just like Lazarus would be outside the gate, and maybe he can hear what's happening, but he's not a part of it. He's begging for a drop of water, so he becomes the beggar. He's in anguish from this flame, just like Lazarus was with his boils, and he receives no comfort from Abraham. So he becomes Lazarus' earthly conditions, but instead of being a small point of time, it becomes eternity. And then we see Lazarus. And his role reversal, he's carried up. He's brought closer to God. He has the company of Abraham by his side. He's far from affliction. He's far from it. And he's comforted. And he's relieved of the burdens of service. That he no longer has to worry about other people. This chasm is fixed. It's no longer him that has to go down and talk to these people for the sake of this rich man. He no longer has to serve them, but he's relieved of these burdens. He has final rest. So ultimately, we see this role reversal. That the rich man becomes poor in the kingdom of heaven, and this poor man, Lazarus, becomes the one who God helps, the one who is rich for eternity. Some lessons that we can learn about this are the finality of judgment. That this chasm is fixed, that you can't cross it either way. And for those that are judged, in torment, this means that you can't reach paradise, that there's going to be a day of a final chance, a final decision. And then also on those on the other side of this chasm, that this is an act of grace or a gift from God, that you can finally have rest, that you no longer have to worry about those in need, that you can just enjoy the rest of God. All right, I think this is important, so I'm going to slow down. People really struggle with, when you're evangelizing, family members that might have gone in the past, that might have passed away, and are no longer with us. And this is something that makes sense, because if they believe, if they buy into this, that might mean that they're saying that their family member is in hell or in torment. And this is really hard for people to process, understandably so. And you can use this passage very effectively, and I think it's one of the points you can derive from it, to say that those that have gone on before you, whether they're with God or they're not, everyone wants you to be with God. That they don't want you to come and meet them. They don't want you to have company with them. And like we said earlier, even if you were to not go with God, even if you were to make the decisions to not be a child of His, and you want to join your relatives, you wouldn't really be joining them. Because hell is isolating. Hell is by yourself. There's not a community in hell. And so this is something that we need to realize when we're talking to people, is that we can use this passage to show that your family members, no matter where they are, want you to be with God, whatever that means. And that by deciding not to be with God, that doesn't mean that you're going to be with your relatives that have gone on before you. I'm going to skip this and go to this. It's ironic at the end of this, it talks about, just send Lazarus back. If he's raised, if you send Lazarus back, then they'll believe. And what Abraham says is they have what they need. They have what they need. And even if someone were to go and to be raised, they wouldn't believe him anyway. And this is ironic because Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And we see many didn't repent. The rich man got what he wanted in Jesus. But many didn't repent, many didn't change their ways. And then also ironically, I don't believe this is the same person, but another person who was raised in the Gospels was Lazarus in John 11. And the passage right after Lazarus is raised is how the Sanhedrin plot to kill Jesus. And so just because someone's raised doesn't mean your whole attitude or character changes. There's going to still be this lack of repentance. And finally, we can be Lazarus because Jesus was raised. That Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, to the cross, where he died, so now we can be the one who God helps. That we can be the one who's with God for eternity. That no matter how poor we are here, there's a reversal in the kingdom of heaven, and we can always be rich in him. Thank you, guys.